One of the biggest questions people had after that episode was, why couldn't Rhaena control Sheepstealer? She finally achieved what she'd dreamed about her entire life. She found a dragon. She survived the claim. Sheepstealer accepted her as his rider. So why did it still feel like she wasn't actually in control? At first, it almost seems like Rhaena is doing something wrong. Maybe she isn't experienced enough. Maybe she isn't commanding enough. Maybe she just isn't as skilled as Daemon or Rhaenyra. But that's actually the wrong way to look at it. Because if there's one lesson House of the Dragon has been teaching us from the very beginning, it's that nobody truly controls a dragon. Not Daemon, not Rhaenyra, not Aemond, not even the greatest dragon riders in Targaryen history. And the person who understood that better than anyone was King Viserys. Remember what he said early in the series?
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion.
At first, it sounds philosophical, but the longer the story goes on, the more you realize he wasn't speaking in riddles. He was telling us exactly how dragons work. Because dragons were never meant to be horses with wings. They're not pets. They're not obedient weapons waiting for commands. They're ancient living creatures with instincts, emotions, pride, fear, and a will of their own. That's why I don't think control is the right word. The better word is trust. Every dragon rider relationship is built on trust. Some bonds become incredibly deep. Others never fully develop. And Rhaena? She was handed probably the hardest dragon anyone could ever hope to bond with. Think about the dragons we've spent time with. Syrax, Caraxes, Meleys, Vermax, Moondancer, even Sunfire. Most of them spent years around Dragonstone. They were used to dragon keepers, used to hearing commands, used to carrying riders. Flying beside humans was simply part of their lives. Now compare that to Sheepstealer. For decades, he lived completely alone. No dragon pit, no castle, no keepers, no rider, nobody feeding him, nobody teaching him commands. His entire life followed one simple rule: survive. If he was hungry, he stole sheep. If someone threatened him, he flew away or fought back. That's where his name comes from. He literally raided farms, grabbed sheep, and disappeared before anyone could stop him. While the royal dragons were treated like priceless treasures, Sheepstealer lived like an outlaw. Freedom became his nature. Now imagine meeting someone who's lived alone their entire life, then expecting them to suddenly trust you completely. That's not how trust works, and it's not how dragons work. Claiming a dragon isn't the same as taming one. When Rhaena climbed onto Sheepstealer's back, she didn't erase decades of wild instincts. She simply became someone the dragon accepted. Those are two very different things, and honestly, that makes Rhaena's story even more heartbreaking. Ever since she was a little girl, she watched everyone around her become dragon riders. Baela had Moondancer, Jace had Vermax, Luke had Arax, Aegon had Sunfire. Even Aemond eventually claimed Vhagar. Everyone found a dragon, except her. Without one, she always felt like she stood just outside the circle. So when she finally found Sheepstealer, it wasn't just about claiming a dragon. It was about proving she belonged, that she was every bit as much a Targaryen as everyone else. Which makes what happens afterwards so tragic. After waiting her entire life, she doesn't get Syrax. She doesn't get Caraxes. She gets the wildest dragon in Westeros. A dragon that had spent decades answering to absolutely nobody. If Viserys was right, then Rhaena wasn't failing. She was simply learning the lesson every dragon rider eventually learns. You don't own a dragon. You don't command a dragon. You build a relationship with one. And some relationships take much longer to grow than others. But if you think Sheepstealer is the only dragon that's ever ignored its rider, think again. Because the greatest example of all was Vhagar. If anyone looked like they had complete control over their dragon, it was Aemond. From the moment he claimed Vhagar, they seemed inseparable. But Vhagar wasn't some young dragon. She had flown with Visenya Targaryen herself during Aegon's conquest. She had lived through generations of kings, wars, and dragon riders. In many ways, Aemond wasn't teaching Vhagar anything. She was the older, wiser half of that relationship, which is exactly why Storm's End changes everything. After Luke flies away on Arax, Aemond gives chase. At first, it feels like intimidation. Two young dragon riders trying to scare each other. Then the storm grows worse. Arax panics. Terrified, he breathes fire at Vhagar. Not because Luke ordered him to, because he was afraid. And that single burst of flame changes everything. Vhagar no longer sees a prank. She sees an attack. Aemond desperately shouts, "No! Serve me!" For the first time, he realizes something terrifying. She's not listening. Within seconds, Vhagar tears Arax apart. Luke dies. The war truly begins. And Aemond is left staring in shock. He thought he was in control. He wasn't. Viserys warned everyone years earlier. The illusion had finally shattered. That moment teaches us something important. Dragons don't just react to commands. They react to fear, anger, pain, instinct. Arax was terrified. Vhagar was enraged. Neither dragon calmly waited for instructions. They behaved exactly like living creatures caught in an impossible situation. That's something people forget. Dragons are intelligent, but intelligence doesn't erase instinct. Now compare that to Daemon and Caraxes. This is probably the strongest bond we've seen in the show. Sometimes Daemon barely has to speak. A glance, a quiet word, a small movement, and Caraxes already understands. Not because Daemon dominates him, because they've spent years building trust, years flying together, surviving together, understanding each other. It feels less like a rider commanding a dragon, and more like two warriors making the same decision at exactly the same time. That's what trust looks like. The same idea applies to Rhaenys and Meleys. Every time they're together, there's a quiet confidence between them. No panic, no unnecessary aggression, just years of experience. When they fight at Rook's Rest, Meleys never abandons her rider. She stays until the very end. Not because she's being forced, because she's loyal. And that's an important distinction. Obedience comes from commands. Loyalty comes from trust. Even Syrax reflects this idea. People often criticize her for not being as fierce as Caraxes or Vhagar. But Syrax reflects Rhaenyra herself. Protective, reserved, more comfortable around family than endless battle. Almost every dragon begins to mirror something about its rider, not because they're magically linked, but because years of trust shape the relationship between them. Which brings us back to Rhaena. People compare her bond with Sheepstealer to Daemon and Caraxes or Rhaenys and Meleys. But that's not a fair comparison. Those relationships were built over years, sometimes decades. Rhaena had barely begun hers. She met Sheepstealer and almost immediately found herself riding a dragon that had spent its entire life answering only to itself. If Daemon and Caraxes represent the destination, Rhaena and Sheepstealer are only at the beginning of the journey. The hardest part wasn't claiming Sheepstealer. The hardest part was earning the trust of a creature that had never needed anyone before. That's really the word that changes everything. Trust. Not control, not ownership, not dominance. Trust. Claiming a dragon isn't the finish line. It's the beginning. Imagine meeting someone for the first time and expecting them to trust you with their life. It doesn't work like that. Trust is earned, one day at a time, one flight at a time, one experience at a time. Dragons, despite all their power, seem to work exactly the same way. And that's something Viserys understood long before everyone else. People often call him weak because he tried so hard to avoid war. But I think he saw something nobody else wanted to admit. The Targaryens had started believing they were gods simply because they rode dragons. They confused partnership with ownership, power with control. Viserys knew better. That's why his quote has become one of the most important lines in the series. The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion. Notice he doesn't say, "We sometimes lose control." He says the very idea of control is an illusion. And the story proves him right over and over again. Think back to the night Aemond claimed Vhagar. People often say Aemond claimed her, but that's only half the story. Vhagar also chose Aemond. If she hadn't, he would have died on that beach. The same thing happened with Rhaena. People say she claimed Sheepstealer, but Sheepstealer accepted her too. If he hadn't, she never would have survived. Dragon claiming isn't a ceremony. It's two living creatures deciding whether they can trust each other. One wrong decision, and it's over. Now imagine what that first flight must have felt like for Rhaena. For years, she dreamed about soaring through the sky like every other member of her family. Finally, it was happening. But instead of feeling completely in control, she was sitting on the back of an animal the size of a castle that had spent decades surviving on its own. Every beat of those wings reminded her of one terrifying truth. If Sheepstealer decided to ignore her, there was almost nothing she could do. That isn't weakness, that's reality. Most dragon riders had years to build trust before war arrived. Rhaena didn't. She barely had time to learn who Sheepstealer was before the world demanded they fight together. And maybe that's what makes her story one of the most human in the entire show. For years, she wasn't enough because everyone around her had something she didn't. Then, when she finally got what she'd always wanted, she discovered that dreams aren't always simple. Sometimes getting your dream is only the beginning of the struggle. Because Sheepstealer isn't evil. He's not broken. He's not trying to embarrass Rhaena. He's simply being exactly what he's always been, a wild dragon. People often judge dragons as though they're humans making moral decisions. They're not. When Vhagar kills Arax, she isn't thinking about politics. She's reacting. When Arax breathes fire, he isn't trying to start a civil war. He's terrified. When Sheepstealer refuses to behave like a perfectly trained war dragon, he's relying on the instincts that kept him alive for decades. That's what animals do. The only difference is these animals breathe fire. One of my favorite details about dragons is that they force their riders to reveal who they really are. You can't fake confidence around a dragon. You can't manipulate a dragon the way you manipulate people at court. A dragon doesn't care whether you're a king, a queen, or the heir to the Iron Throne. It cares about the bond. If dragons only cared about bloodlines, every Targaryen could ride every dragon. But that's never been true. Some dragons hatch beside their riders. Some accept new riders later in life. Some never accept anyone at all. A dragon can never simply be inherited like a castle. It has to choose you too. That's why Daemon and Caraxes are so fascinating. People love to say Daemon controls Caraxes. I don't think he does. I think Caraxes trusts Daemon. There's a difference. Watch the way they move together. Sometimes Daemon barely needs to speak. A slight movement, a quiet command, and Caraxes responds, not because he's a machine following orders, but because years of shared experience created something deeper. The same goes for Rhaenys and Meleys. Their final flight is so emotional because you never question whether Meleys wants Rhaenys on her back. She does. There's complete trust between them. Now compare that to Rhaena. How many flights had she shared with Sheepstealer? Almost none. How many battles? None. People were comparing a bond that had barely begun to relationships that had taken years to grow. That was never going to be fair. And there's something else people overlook. Rhaena wasn't just learning Sheepstealer. Sheepstealer was learning Rhaena. Trust goes both ways. Imagine spending your entire life alone. Every human you've ever encountered either feared you, hunted you, or stayed away from you. Then suddenly one climbs onto your back expecting complete trust. Wouldn't that take time? Of course it would. That's exactly why Viserys' words become even more powerful the longer you think about them. He never said dragons couldn't be guided. He never said they couldn't become loyal. He simply rejected the idea of control. Because control suggests ownership. And dragons were never meant to be owned. They're partners, sometimes willing, sometimes stubborn, sometimes gentle, sometimes terrifying, just like people. So when people ask, why couldn't Rhaena control Sheepstealer? I think they're asking the wrong question. The better question is, why did we expect her to? Why would the most independent dragon in Westeros suddenly become perfectly obedient after one successful claim? Why would decades of surviving alone disappear overnight? They wouldn't. And that's exactly what makes this story feel so real. Because in the end, Rhaena didn't fail. She wasn't weak. She wasn't unworthy. She wasn't any less of a Targaryen than Daemon, Rhaenyra, or Aemond. She simply learned the truth that every dragon rider eventually learns. A dragon is never truly yours. You don't conquer it. You don't own it. The best dragon riders don't create obedience. They earn trust. Sometimes quickly, sometimes over years, and sometimes, with a dragon like Sheepstealer, that trust takes longer than anyone expects. Because the greatest bond between a dragon and its rider was never built on fear. It was never built on commands. It was built on two extraordinary creatures choosing, day after day, to trust one another. And maybe that's why Viserys was right all along. The Targaryens didn't rule because they controlled dragons. They ruled because, for a little while, they were fortunate enough to be trusted by them. And those are two very different things.